Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hazardous Waste Management Training for Small Waste Generators. The goal of this class is to inform and instruct you on the basic requirements that you are required to follow as a hazardous waste generator. Many of you may be attending this class because of an inspection by someone from our agency. This class is designed to arm you with the knowledge that you need in order to properly manage your wastes. First, we'll provide a brief overview of the general types of small businesses that generate hazardous waste and general types of hazardous waste streams. We'll cover briefly how to perform a hazardous waste determination and what the characteristics of a hazardous waste are. Next, we'll discuss the requirements for generators of hazardous waste. We'll talk about labeling, container requirements, inspection requirements, how long you can store the waste on site as a small quantity generator, as well as some other cases such as point of generation. We'll also cover what you are required to do to prepare your facility for emergencies and what you are required to do to prevent emergencies from occurring. And finally, we'll discuss some basic information about how to properly ship your hazardous waste off-site. First, let's talk about some common types of small quantity waste generators. These can include vehicle maintenance facilities like auto repair, auto body, and transmission shops, who might generate hazardous waste from vehicle fluids. Service stations, gas stations, and fleet service stations may generate these types of wastes as well. Machine shops and metal fabrication shops may generate oily coolant waste from their machines. Cabinet finishing and paint contractors can generate paint waste and solvent waste. Biotech labs, research labs, and semiconductor facilities generate lab debris, solvent waste, and soldering wastes. So, what is a hazardous waste? Well, in order for something to be a hazardous waste, it first has to be a waste. The definitions for these terms are defined in law and regulation, found in the Code of California Regulations, or CCR, and in Health and Safety Code, or HSC. In CCR 66261.2 and in HSC 25124, a waste is defined as any discarded material in any physical state, such as solid, semi-solid, liquid, or gas, that is not otherwise excluded from the definition of a waste. A discarded material is a material that is burned, disposed of, recycled, relinquished, or inherently waste-like. We're not going to go in depth into these definitions, and for the most part, any discarded material that your facility produces is going to be considered a waste under California law. Okay, so now you've determined your facility is generating a waste. So what? The next step is to determine whether that waste that you generate is a hazardous waste. This is called making a hazardous waste determination. A hazardous waste is a waste that has the potential to cause harm to human health or the environment and is defined in a few different ways. The EPA and Cal EPA has lists of what is considered a hazardous waste and also has defined certain characteristics that, if they were exhibited by the waste, would cause the waste to be a hazardous waste. The important thing to note is that the responsibility of making a hazardous waste determination is on you, the generator of that waste. As a CUPA, it is not up to us to determine whether your waste that you generate is hazardous or not. There are two main ways of determining whether your waste is hazardous. One is having the waste tested by a certified environmental laboratory for a hazardous waste characteristic. And two, applying generator knowledge based on the process that generated the waste to determine whether the waste would meet the definition of a hazardous waste. In either case, you must keep all documentation that helped you make that determination for at least 3 years from the date that the waste was last sent for disposal, and you must have all documentation ready for an inspector to review. And these records can include the analytical reports from a certified environmental laboratory, process diagrams, material toxicity data, safety data sheets, or any calculations that you may have used to help you make your hazardous waste determination. A quick warning about hazardous waste determinations. If you determine that your waste is non-hazardous, it could be challenged by this office, and you could be prosecuted for illegal disposal if the waste that you determine to be non-hazardous actually turns out to be a hazardous waste. If you're not sure if your waste is hazardous, the best management practice is to send your waste for testing to a certified environmental laboratory, because this provides you with an independent and objective analysis to help you make your waste determination. Now, let's talk about the basics of hazardous waste chemistry. I mentioned briefly that there are certain characteristics that can make a waste a hazardous waste. And the good news is it's not that tricky to remember what those characteristics are. And as you can see on the screen, tricky is a mnemonic device that you can use to help you remember the four characteristics of a hazardous waste. If your waste is T, toxic, R, reactive, I, ignitable, or C, corrosive, then your waste is a hazardous waste. We'll go over the specifics of each characteristic in the next few slides. Let's start with T, toxic. Toxic wastes include wastes that have certain metals or chemicals that can cause harm to humans or the environment, wastes that can kill fish if released into the aquatic environment, or wastes that cause short or long-term negative health effects on humans. And some examples of these types of wastes are lead acid batteries. The lead is a harmful metal and the acid is corrosive. Used oil. Used oil can kill fish if it's released into the environment and is often contaminated with toxic metals. Antifreeze. Materials contaminated with used oil, such as rags or absorbent. Parts cleaning solutions. Used paints. Used pesticides. Solder and dross. Ethidium bromide, which is often used in lab settings. And disinfectants or sterilants. And as you can see from the comics on this slide, toxic waste can have acute effects or chronic effects, but both would be considered a hazardous waste. Reactive wastes are the next characteristic. The most common kind of reactivity that you're likely to encounter are angry customers, but some other examples include strong peroxides and finely powdered metals, and metals that can react with water to produce violent explosions or reactions. For example, in the upper right, you can see some sort of metal halide, such as sodium, violently reacting with water to produce sparks and heat. In the lower right, you can see what's sometimes called elephant's toothpaste, which is the result of hydrogen peroxide reacting with potassium iodide. In both cases, the materials are considered reactive because of how fast and potentially violently these materials react with each other. Ignitable or flammable wastes are wastes that can flash to fire because they release flammable vapors readily into the air. Flammable wastes include waste gasoline, solvent-based cleaners, paint thinners, acetone, wood stains or paints with solvent-based carriers, and aerosol can propellants. On the right, you can see a picture with a mound of rags contaminated with wood stain. A lot of wood stains and oil-based paints can contain linseed oil, and rags that are contaminated with boiled linseed oil have the potential to spontaneously ignite. Therefore, these wastes would be needed to be managed correctly. Corrosive wastes are wastes that have a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5. The lower the pH, the more acidic the waste is. Acidic wastes include lead acid batteries, etching solutions, and acidic lab chemicals and reagents. The higher the pH, the more alkaline the waste is. Alkaline wastes include some parts washer solutions, some lab chemicals and reagents, and potentially the liquid in your mop bucket. One quick thing to note is that some floor cleaning degreasers can have a high pH in order to break down the oily matter. If the pH of your leftover mop water is greater than 12.5, then it would be considered hazardous for corrosivity. Now, we're going to talk about some of the common waste streams generated by different industries. In auto shops, Gas filters and used oil filters are contaminated with used oil or fuel and need to be properly managed. However, there are some relaxed requirements for these wastes that we'll cover later. Vehicle fluids like used oil and used coolant are common hazardous waste streams. Spent parts, wash, spent parts washer liquid and oily mop water can also be hazardous. And lastly, lead acid batteries contain lead and sulfuric acid. However, these wastes also have some relaxed requirements that we'll cover towards the end of the presentation. Some waste streams that are common to other industries include old paints, including latex paints, oil-based paints, and varnishes. Note that any waste generated from paint cleanup, like waste thinner, acetone, or wash water, may be hazardous as well. Contaminated solids from spill cleanup or containment, think used absorbent, oily cardboard, saturated rags, etc., may also be hazardous. And keep an eye out for old or expired pesticides, non-empty aerosols, or waste gasoline, because these may be considered hazardous waste as well. Some common waste streams seen in labs or tech support industries can include solder flux and solder dross. Many facilities will point to the fact that the solder wire that they use is lead-free. However, you should note that this doesn't necessarily mean that it's hazard-free. It could contain other toxic metals that could cause it to become regulated. Lab waste, such as Q-tips, wipes, gloves, or other PPE that could be contaminated with solvents, metals, or other toxic chemicals, are another common waste stream in this industry. Cutting fluids or coolants from CNC or other manufacturing machines can also be toxic. And other lab wastes, such as acetone, ethidium bromide gels, other solvent wastes, acid-base wastes, metal wastes, or gram staining waste can all exhibit characteristics of a hazardous waste. Now, before we move on to our next topic, I just want to open up briefly for any questions that you may have regarding waste determinations, common waste streams, or the characteristics of a hazardous waste.